So the next thing we're going to cover here is basically defending the papacy of Pope Gregory XVII. Because, of course, there are going to be Sedevacantists, SSPX, whoever they are, that will make a bunch of false claims about his papacy, about why he wasn't the Pope. They will claim he lost the papacy, all this kind of stuff. So we're going to cover all of that and basically defend the papacy of Pope Gregory XVII from these errors and false claims by these people, okay? Because as I mentioned before, with the Catholic faith, it is not only necessary to profess the truth, but it is necessary to be able to defend the truth, right? And of course, not every single person is called by God to be, I guess, intellectually or academically equipped with the necessary information and understanding to defend the Pope and defend the church effectively from like heresy and error and false claims and stuff. But some people are. And so today we're going to be getting into that. Okay. First, you see this image here, Pope Pius XII with his hand-picked successor, the future Pope Gregory XVII, circa 1955 AD. All right, so Pius XII and Gregory XVII, two popes right there. Well, at least one being a future pope at that time. A prelate, this is entitled, When Does Someone Become Pope? A prelate becomes pope as soon as he accepts the election. Okay? As soon as he accepts, from that moment, he's a pope. There's a quote here. If a candidate received the 2/3 vote, the cardinal dean approaches the newly elected pontiff and asks him whether he will accept the election and by what name he wishes to be known. If he accepts, all the cardinals arise and the canopies of all the chairs are lowered except that of the Pope, who is conducted behind the altar where he is clothed in the papal garments. The person thus elected Pope acquires full jurisdiction over the universal church immediately on consenting and becomes the vicar of Christ on earth. This is from Daniel M. Gallagher, Imprimatur 1917 AD, pages 106 to 107. So the fact that Giuseppe Siri chose the name Gregory XVII is proof that he accepted his election and became Pope, okay? Now, did Gregory XVII lose the papacy? There are two principal arguments people may bring up to argue that Gregory XVII lost the papacy, because some people will claim that he was elected Pope, he did become the Pope, but he lost the papacy, right? The first principal argument is that he resigned and therefore was no longer Pope. The second is that since he publicly acknowledged the anti-popes and participated in Vatican II or other religious activities with them, he lost the papacy due to being a heretic, okay? We will now address both of these false arguments. Regarding resignation, any abdication of the papacy, which Gregory XVII made in the 1958 conclave due to threats, etc., would be null, void, and worthless. He would still remain the Pope. Why? Because resignation due to fear imposed on the prelate is invalid. This is the 1917 Code of Canon Law, Canon 185. Resignation is invalid by law if it was made out of grave fear unjustly inflicted, or from fraud, substantial error, or simony, okay? So as I mentioned before, if Gregory XVII tried to resign from his papacy due to the death threats and the little, I think the little note was in the 1978 one, I think, right? According to that Malachi Martin guy. But if the Pope in 1958, for example, in that conclave, tried to resign from his papacy due to like death threats or intimidation and that kind of stuff, that would make his resignation invalid. Okay, he would still actually be the Pope, even if he says like, I'm not the Pope anymore, I resigned. He would still be the Pope because the reason he attempted to resign was due to death threats and, or grave fear unjustly inflicted. Yeah. All right. Now, regarding the argument that Pope Gregory XVII was a public heretic and therefore lost his office, the element of imposed fear also needs to be heavily considered. Why? Because if one acts contrary to the faith out of fear, but inwardly retains one's Catholic faith, one is not a formal heretic. Okay? That person is not a formal heretic. There is also a pope from the past who did something similar out of fear, and we will talk about him later. Also, as you saw in the videos, Pope Gregory XVII publicly said that he would undo the Vatican II changes, and according to the popeinred.com, he did not support any of them. He did not support any of them, but actually kept Genoa faithful to Catholic tradition. Here is an excerpt on the popeinred.com defending the Pope from the attacks of John Veneri. Quote, I'm going to quote this whole excerpt now. It is unthinkable to John Veneri that if Pope Gregory XVII were the true Pope, then he would never have signed the Vatican II Council decrees. Yet he stated, "We will not be bound by these decrees." Those who can see, please note the royal "we" in the Holy Father's statement. This is the way the popes of old would speak. Another important clue that his signature was coerced and that his own authority took precedence over the anti-papacy and the anti-council. Okay? They're saying this is another important clue that his signature was coerced and that his own authority took precedence over the anti-papacy and the anti-council. It is unthinkable to John Veneri that if Pope Gregory XVII was the true Pope, he would have adopted the reforms of the anti-council, celebrated the Novus Ordo Missae, ordained priests in the new rite, and consecrated bishops in the new rite. But it is thinkable to John Veneri that the man who substituted a new modernist religion for the ancient faith, new sacraments, and extinguished the sacrament of orders under the seal of the fisherman's ring was the true Pope. Okay? So he's basically saying here, to John Veneri, it is absurd to say that the true Pope, would go along with Vatican II or ordain people in the new rite and all this kind of stuff. But it is thinkable and it makes sense that the new Pope would basically carry out a modernist revolution. And let's see, that's the end of the quote there. No, it continues. It says, the Pope in Red website cites evidence that Pope Gregory XVII resisted all of this. Walter Matt's remnant newspaper reported that in Genoa, where Pope Gregory presided as Cardinal Archbishop in official capacity, churches looked the same in 1989 as they had in 1940. Priests offered Mass facing the altars with no conciliar Masonic table of the book in sight. There is evidence he covertly ordained priests for the church in eclipse, as the sacrament of orders had been extinguished in the Novus Ordo. He said again, as the sacrament of orders had been extinguished in the Novus Ordo, the significance of this can hardly be understated. However, it is also clear that he had great remorse over the compromises that he made to fulfill the goals of his papacy. Regarding one not being a formal heretic if acting out of fear, right? This is a quote from Father Dominic Prummer, his Handbook of Moral Theology, Chapter 3, Article 2, Apostasy and Heresy, number 202. It says, heresy, considered objectively, is a proposition that contradicts an article of faith. In its subjective and formal aspect, heresy is the pertinacious error of a Christian who repudiates some truth of the Catholic faith. Therefore, for formal heresy, there is required error in the intellect and pertinacity in the will. Consequently, the following are not formal heretics. A, those who from fear or some other motive make an external denial of faith while inwardly preserving their consent to it. Okay? So people who say that Gregory XVII was not the Pope or lost the papacy and stuff because he was seen, with the anti-popes or with the Vatican II people and all that kind of stuff, do not sufficiently consider the case of someone who is acting out of fear, okay, while inwardly preserving their Catholic faith. And we're going to see in the future in this presentation that there was actually another pope in church history who did something very similar. Here we go. Pope Saint Marcellinus sacrificed to idols out of fear, right? But according to Saint Robert Bellarmine, since he did this out of fear and not because he was a true heretic, he did not lose the papacy. Here's the quote. It says, Saint Robert Bellarmine, writing on the errors falsely ascribed to older... I messed up my words. Saint Robert Bellarmine, writing on the errors falsely ascribed to early popes, said, quote, "The 10th is Pope Marcellinus, who sacrificed to idols, as is certain from the Pontifical of Damascus, the Council of St. Visanus, and from the Epistle of Nicholas I to the Emperor Michael. But Marcellinus neither taught something against faith, nor was a heretic or unfaithful, except by an external act on account of the fear of death." Now, whether he fell from the pontificate due to that external act or not, little is related. Later, he abdicated the pontificate and shortly thereafter was crowned with martyrdom. Still, I believe that he would not have fallen from the pontificate ipso facto, because it was certain to all that he sacrificed to idols only out of fear. Okay? So someone acting out of fear is a very important detail to consider when making a claim, for example, that Giuseppe Siri was not the Pope due to certain actions that he did or public things you saw him involved with. Okay? Acting out of fear nullifies a lot of stuff, right? It basically does not make the person a formal heretic. According to St. Robert Bellarmine here, it does not make the person ipso facto lose the papacy because they're acting out of fear, right? And this is from On the Roman Pontiff, Book 4, Chapter 8. Now, TCW had a webpage about Pope St. Marcellinus, but the link is currently down. Here are excerpts about it from an email I sent to someone a while ago. So when I made these slides, I think TCW's website was having some issues. I don't know if the link is there now. I can look for it. In fact, let me try and see if I can find it right now. All right, I found it. So it's here now. The article is entitled, "Moot If Hostage Pope Gregory XVII, Siri Said New Mass." Okay. Let's zoom in here. April 26th, Feast of Pope St. Marcellinus. Some uncatechized and are willfully ignorant people have tried to say that Pope Gregory XVII, 1958 and 1989, who was under grave duress for 30 years by the Freemasons, lost his papacy for possibly offering the reprobate New Order Mass. Please see the Catholic historical precedent of another prisoner pope who had his free will impeded by satanic persecutors, His Holiness Pope St. Marcellinus, whose feast it is today. The Roman Breviary reads on April 5th, "During the cruel persecution of the Emperor Diocletian, Marcellinus of Rome, overcome with terror, offered incense to the idols of the gods. For this sin he did penance, and wearing a hair shirt, went to the Council of Sinueso, where many bishops had assembled, and there openly confessed his crime." Note, this act did not constitute the loss of the papacy, since it was done under grave duress at the time. Pope St. Marcellinus is listed obviously on the official list of popes. St. Thomas Aquinas teaches, in order to constitute a genuine true act of the will, the act must be performed spontaneously, freely, without constraint or force, and that man can be coerced or forced to do something against his will in two ways, by violence and by fear. That which is done under exterior violence is wholly involuntary. The life of St. Marcellinus, Pope and Martyr, died in 304 AD. Pope Marcellinus ruled the Church of Rome for 9 years and 4 months. By order of Emperors Diocletian and Maximin, he was taken prisoner and brought forward to offer sacrifice to the idols. At first he refused and was threatened with various kinds of torture, and for fear of the threatened suffering, he put down 2 grains of incense in sacrifice to the gods. This gave great joy to the infidels, but caused the faithful immense sadness. However, under a weak head, members rise up and make little of the threats of the princes, so the faithful came to the Pope and reproached him severely. He realized the gravity of his error and offered himself to be judged by a council of bishops. The bishops responded, "It is not possible for the Supreme Pontiff to be judged by anyone, but you yourself weigh your case in your own mind and pronounce your own judgment." The Pope, repentant, lamented his fault and deposed himself, but the whole gathering immediately re-elected him. When the emperors heard of this, they had him arrested again. He absolutely refused to offer sacrifice to the idols, so they sentenced him to be beheaded. Then the persecution was renewed with such a fury that in 1 month, 17,000 Christians were put to death. Note, and when it says here, Christians, this is referring to only Catholics, okay, not talking about heretics. Because you see like Protestants and stuff, they would talk about church history and like, oh, Christians were killed in the Colosseum and stuff, talking as if like they represent these Christians today. You are heretics. The people who are being put to death in the Colosseum were Catholics, right? You are the enemy of those people, but they act as if like they are like this Christian, they're their descendants or their successors in terms of Christianity and stuff. And it's like, that's not your history, my guy. That's Catholic history. It's not your history. Your history is Martin Luther talking a bunch of blasphemous filth. That's your history. Our history is all the way back to the Colosseum and, of course, back to the apostles. That's Catholic history. So I hate to see Protestants talking about church history as if like they're like real Christians. Anyways, continuing. Note, Pope Marcellinus did not ipso facto lose his office as Pope. He weighed his own specific case in his own mind and then judged to depose himself, but was immediately re-elected. TCW learned in 2006 that Pope Gregory XVII, Siri, in discussing with trusted clergy in the spring of 1988 concerning his own lethal duress situation, concurred with them that as he was not a free moral agent to act due to his being a captive of the Freemasons, it removes culpability for his seeming transgressions against the faith, such as attending the apostate V2 council or presiding in public gatherings staged by the anti-popes. When Marcellinus was about to be beheaded, he declared himself unworthy of Christian burial and excommunicated all who might presume to bury him. Thus his body lay above ground for 35 days. At the end of that time, the Apostle Peter appeared to Marcellus, who had succeeded as Pope, and said, Brother Marcellus, why do you not bury me? Marcellus replied, Have you not yet been buried, my lord? Peter said, I consider myself unburied as long as Marcellinus is unburied. Marcellus replied, But don't you know, my lord? Marcellus asked, that he laid a curse on anyone who buried him? Peter responded, Is it not written that he who humbles himself shall be exalted? You should have kept this in mind. Now go and bury him at my feet. Marcellus went straight away and carried out the orders laudably. From Blessed Jacobus of Voragines' sacred Legenda Aurea, circa 1260 AD. And this is a quote from Bishop Whitman here. Violent hands will be laid on the supreme head of the Catholic Church. Yes, the flock will become small, okay? Small. So that is about Pope St. Marcellinus there, okay? There's an article about him. Let's go back to the slides now. So we just read through this, so I don't need to read this again. Let's see. All right. Yeah. All right. So in many ways, we can say that the papacy of Gregory XVII was an extended version of what happened to Pope St. Marcellinus. Pope St. Marcellinus acted against his will for a short time. Pope Gregory XVII acted against his will for decades. Let's see. I'm trying to think. Hold on. Yeah, so this one I wasn't able to find the article for this, but let me just read what it says here. I can't find the webpage again, but on TCW's website, I believe they mentioned a situation in church history where a pope was imprisoned and presumed to have died in captivity. Then a new quote unquote pope was elected, but then the true pope was discovered to still be alive, and the pope wrongly acknowledged the anti-pope as pope before he once again acknowledged that he was still the pope. Okay, so there have been many situations in church history where like who the pope was very confusing and stuff like that. This is not the first time this has happened. Like the Western Schism, for example, right? Probably, I guess, the most confusing one of all. So this is not a new kind of situation as far as not being sure who the true pope is, or the true pope acknowledging an anti-pope when he's actually the true pope and stuff like that. This stuff has happened before.